Hi, I'm Nick Shackleton-Jones, author of a book called How People Learn, which introduces the first general theory of learning, something called the affective context model. And by general theory, I mean a theory which accounts for human learning just as well as it does animal learning, formal contexts as well as informal contexts, and which explains a whole variety of learning phenomena from classical conditioning through to contemporary neuroscience. At the heart of the book is a radical idea, which is that we don't remember experiences. Instead, we encode our reactions to experiences, and we use these feelings to reconstruct them, which, amongst other things, accounts for the weird inaccuracy of human memory. So, in the next few minutes, I'm going to explain where this thinking has come from and how we can apply it to education and learning. I'm going to go fairly fast to be respectful of your time, so hold on to your hats. First off, how can we think about learning? And then secondly, how do we actually apply this to encourage learning in an educational context or in learning design? So the first thing to do is to disambiguate these two things, learning and education. We've started using the word education as if it meant learning, and learning as if we're referring to education, but really they're very radically different things. Education is a set of, anthropologically speaking, weird rituals, mainly focused around memorizing facts that don't mean much to us, that have arisen in the last couple of 100 years, whereas learning is a natural process that we have in common with many creatures, which is really radically different when we look at it from the process of education. Learning is reaction-based. We wander around the world, things happen, things that are significant get stored, and we use those to change our behavior, whereas education is sort of fact-based. We sit in a classroom and try to memorize some stuff. Your learning is typically task-led. So as you hit problems in your everyday life, you'll Google things or YouTube things, and you'll figure them out as you go. Whereas education is topic-led. Somebody comes up with a list of things to go in a curricula, and then all of this is dumped on you somehow. Learning is more generally more like a conversation where there's a to and fro between different participants. Whereas education is often a top-down lecture where one person tells you everything that they know, whether or not it's actually relevant to you. Learning is user-centric, it's driven by what I care about and what I'm trying to do, whereas education is often instructor-centric. It's about what the instructor wants to tell you because it's just more convenient that way. When we look at experts and their expertise, upwards of 70% of their learning is often implicit. That's to say they can't actually tell you how they know, what exactly they know, whereas education is all focused on explicit knowledge, which gives people often this weird paradoxical feeling that they've sat in education, learned a lot of stuff, but they haven't really learned anything at all. And often people only report really learning how to do something when they start a job. Learning is context-centric. We know this is true of humans and other animals. Learning often happens in different contexts, whereas weirdly in education we sit in one place and we're expected just to absorb a lot of content. Finally, education is often anxiety-driven. It's about tests and passing tests and what that will mean for your future. Whereas learning as it occurs naturally is more playful activity where we experiment and we fail and we learn from that. So where did we go wrong? I think there's a few places we went wrong, but one of the really bad turns was this piece of research by Hermann Ebbinghaus. Now, in 1885, Hermann Ebbinghaus was seduced by a trendy new approach called psychophysics, which was all about trying to make psychology a bit more respectable. And in order to do that, Hermann Ebbinghaus came up with what he considered to be a pure stimulus to experiment with. What was this pure stimulus? Well, it was something he called trigrams, which were three-letter nonsense syllables like R, B, F, which you put together a list and then you'd have to try and remember as many of those as you possibly could. And he thought this was a good thing, stripping the stimulus of any personal significance at all. But what he found is that when he gave people these lists, they tended to forget the vast majority of it very quickly. Now, what does that mean? Well, there's actually only one sensible conclusion to draw from that, which is that learning is all about personal significance. We remember stuff that matters to us. But that's not the conclusion Ebbinghaus drew. Incredibly, he believed that this represented something normal about memory, a forgetting curve, if you like, and he looked at ways that we could actually reduce this forgetting. Now, to see how just bizarre that was, imagine you're investigating digestion and you fed people glass beads and you notice that they didn't digest them. They just went straight through. Probably the last thing that you would do is try and force feed them over and over again in order to get them retain a few of them a little bit longer. But sadly, that's exactly what Ebbinghaus did. And even more sadly, that became the basis of something called rote learning, which is still part of a lot of education today. So it was a horrible mistake to make. To see just how obviously it was a mistake, you can try this. Here's a page of trigrams. And I've mixed them up. 50% are Hermann Ebbinghaus style, so they're MJQ, ZSE, and the other 50% are things that are meaningful, things like fog or tea or rot. You can give a list like this to your children, if you like. Always good to experiment on your children. And ask them, let's say, how many they will be able to memorize in the space of 2 minutes. And perhaps offer them some sort of reward. What do you think they're going to do? My prediction would be that they will dump all the meaningless ones and immediately memorize or tend to memorize the ones that are personally significant in some way. So how do we ever end up in such a bad place with education? Well, it probably goes all the way back to Plato. Plato used the metaphor of the charioteer and the horses to separate out reason and emotion. The charioteer was reason and the horses were emotion, good and bad. And this was carried through a kind of philosophical thought, a rationalist tradition, all the way to a guy called Descartes, who separated out the mind and the body. And the mind was kind of pure and indubitable, and the body was the source of emotions and to be doubted. A bad thing, really. Emotions bad, reason and thinking good. But a number of people began to notice that there was something fundamentally wrong with these. Not least of all, a guy called Frederic Bartlett, who was one of the contemporaries of Hermann Ebbinghaus, and as I've done, noted that Hermann Ebbinghaus had destroyed the very thing that he was trying to investigate. In stripping his stimulus of any personal significance, he was no longer investigating memory at all. Instead, Ebbinghaus used meaningful stimuli to investigate memory. So, for example, pictures of faces, military men at the time. What he found was that people tended to remember certain things that mattered. They tended to remember, for example, the expressions on people's faces. They tended to remember what type of hat people were wearing, which made a lot of difference at the time. He also investigated stories and memory for stories. He used this story, The War of the Ghosts, which was a Native American fable, and had people retell it. And he noticed that the results looked nothing like Ebbinghaus's. In fact, people are pretty good at remembering stories. If somebody tells you a story, you probably tell it to other people. What Bartlett found was that the people tended to simplify it, but also convert it into things which were meaningful for them. Why are stories important? Well, stories are fantastically effective at improving memory. Bauer and Clark found that you could improve memory for words, recall that is, 7-fold by getting people to convert them into a narrative format. Now, that's interesting because that's probably the biggest effect that, if you're watching this, you've ever seen in memory research. And yet, this research was done, I think, in the 1960s. Very few people know about it, and we certainly don't make this the heart of our educational practices or instructional design. Why? What is it that we don't like about stories? Well, generally, one of the things people don't like about stories is it doesn't fit with the book or the computational model of the mind. Stories tend to change things. Stories are unreliable. Whereas a book, if you write something in it, stays the same, or a computer stores things in the same way. And we've been misled by this computational metaphor of the mind. And we've overlooked the fact that in humans, this changing and recreation of information is essential to the way that we remember. Somebody who provided a lot of detail around this was a researcher called Elizabeth Loftus, and she invented stories of a particular kind, of particular significance in our culture, which is eyewitness testimony. How does eyewitness testimony change? She showed people a picture of a car accident, and then she asked them to recall how fast the cars were going. And sometimes she used a word with much more emotional power, like smashed. How fast were the cars going when they smashed? Or versus how fast were the cars going when they contacted? And interestingly, this affective significance of the question massively varied. Estimates from just above 30 miles per hour to just above 40 miles an hour, depending on the word she used. She also found that she could get people to remember things that were never there, like broken glass, when she used the word smashed. And that's really interesting because it begins to suggest that there really isn't that distinction between episodic and semantic memory. If you can get people to remember things that didn't happen by using a certain set of words, how reliable is their episodic memory? She actually investigated this even further in an experiment called Lost in the Mall. She found that she could get people to remember things that never happened to them. And bizarre as that sounds, we do this all the time. When you think about birthdays, you may well remember them having balloons and cake, even though pictures may show that they weren't there. So information actually isn't separate in semantic and episodic categories. It actually flows between the two. But as I say, our memories are tremendously unreliable. A company called Branded did a particularly interesting piece of research into this, asking people to remember Starbucks logos. And what they found is that people's memory for Starbucks logos and other logos was shockingly inaccurate. Pretty much the only thing that they could remember was the presence of a woman and the colour green, which is really interesting. If you don't believe this, you can try it for yourself. Try recreating a £5 note or a $5 or a $10 bill from memory without looking at it. You'll be shocked at how poor your memory actually is. So we sort of tricked ourselves into thinking that memory works differently than it does, is more accurate than it really is. So what's really going on with memory if we look at it honestly? One of the first researchers to look at this at the neurophysiological level was a guy called Donald Hebb, who in 1949 coined the phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together. And it's a lovely way of illustrating something that he found in his research, which was that when two neurons in your brain are simultaneously active, they tend to form connections. But the interesting thing about that is it begs the central question. What are they doing? What are they encoding? So what we know is that as you're moving around the world, buying coffee, getting on a train, your brain is somehow rewiring based on the firing. But what we don't know is what that rewiring is encoding. What is it storing? Is it storing sounds? Is it storing sights? Is it storing meanings or schema? The answer, the affective context model says, is none of those things. What your brain is actually encoding with that firing and rewiring is your reactions, your emotional reactions to the world around you. Now, radical as this idea seems, there's a growing body of support from neuroscience. Researchers like Antonio Damasio in his book Descartes' Error, also Jaak Panksepp, looking at the foundations of human and animal emotions, and also one of Damasio's students, Mary Helen Imodino Yang, have begun to find that when you look neurologically at people, the two systems aren't distinct. We don't have a box in our brain for emotions and a box in our brain for reason, as Descartes thought. In fact, the two systems are thoroughly integrated, and this is why Mary Helen Imodino Yang says in a New York Times article, it is literally neurobiologically impossible to build memories, engage complex thoughts, or make meaningful decisions without emotion. Emotion is integrated into our cognition. We just haven't quite figured out how. But that's what I want to talk about here. One really important concept is the thing that's referred to in this bottom left quote, homeostasis. The basic idea is that if you're a fairly simple organism, let's say swimming around the sea, and you want to survive, it's super helpful if you can remember bad situations. But you've only got a primitive nervous system, so you don't want to have complex schema that represents situations. All you need to be able to remember, to be able to avoid them in future, is the negative reaction. As long as you can remember that when you were in that cold place, for example, that was a kind of a painful experience, you can avoid that when you start to feel something similar again. And the idea is that human cognition is not any different to that. It's basically just a scaling up of complexity, but qualitatively it's exactly the same. So how does that apply to human cognition? So this is the affective context model as a diagram. The idea is we don't actually remember any of the experiences that happened to us. Instead, we store our reactions to those events and how they made us feel. And these reactions are then used to kind of conjure up, confabulate, reconstruct a memory when needed. So we might start out as an infant being quite frightened by a stimulus, but as we develop as an adult, those reactions become differentiated, become far more sophisticated. We have micro reactions to, let's say, different dog breeds, and those reactions allow us to remember dogs of different types, but also govern the kinds of people that we become. As an example, if you're an infant whose parents have a frightened, terrified reaction, start swatting madly every time they see a wasp, that is likely to be kind of passed on to you because you pick up on those reactions. Now, you might think that this is a ridiculous idea. How could our emotional reactions possibly be sophisticated enough to enable us to remember quite complex events? Well, I'm not talking about just gross emotional reactions like kind of happy and sad and angry. I'm talking about all of the subtle emotional reactions that we have to everything in the world around us. And as an example, if you met people with these different haircuts, I have no doubt that you would have subtly different emotional reactions to each of them. But you'd really struggle to explain to me how those emotional reactions differed. Equally, if I ask you to imagine the sound of a bumblebee or a mosquito or a fly, you know that those create a different emotional reaction in you, just imagining those different sounds. But how exactly do those subtle emotional reactions differ? Well, that's all hidden from you, that mechanics, but it allows you to generate, using systems like the visuospatial scratchpad, a quick kind of sketch based on those emotional reactions. Some experimental support of this comes from a fascinating experiment carried out by Damasio and Bashara called the Iowa gambling task. What they did in this task was they had 4 decks of cards. 2 of the decks of cards were good decks, by which I mean when you pulled cards from them, on average they would be rewarding, and 2 of the decks of cards had on average more penalties, so you would incur like a financial loss. And your job was to figure out which were the good decks and bad decks. But of course within the decks the cards are randomized, so you had to pull a few out before you could figure it out. And what they did was they monitored people's galvanic skin response, which is a measure of their, if you like, system 1 or intuitive implicit learning as they were doing the task. And it was fascinating. What they found was that it took them about 50 draws from the decks to be confident that those were the bad decks and these were the good ones. But interestingly, after only 10 draws, their galvanic skin response peaked when they hovered over a bad deck, suggesting that learning was taking place implicitly, far in advance of the explicit learning. And that's fascinating because it means that learning really, it suggests at least, that learning really is this implicit process, and that the explicit learning is really very much a kind of a catch-up, something where we kind of tidy that up at the end. And in case that sounds strange, it's something that I've encountered in my professional life where, for example, you ask a safety expert to talk about safety and they will say safety is really important. But nothing really is conveyed by that statement until the safety expert tells you about why it's important, tells you the stories of things that happened or things that went wrong and the impact those had on people. So the real learning happens at this implicit level. And we just somehow got deluded that we could kind of skip that process and share information explicitly. So to summarise, the question is, where did we go wrong? How did we end up thinking that somehow education had anything to do with learning? The answer is that learning is not knowledge transfer. And many of the approaches that we see called learning, or frankly education, are based on the idea that somehow learning is about transferring knowledge from one head to another. So what is learning and what really is memory? Well, learning, as I define it, is a change in behaviour or capability as a result of memory. That's a fairly uncontentious definition, but it rests on a definition of memory which is very different. Namely, memory as the encoding of an affective response to an experience which allows that experience to be reconstructed. Part of the beauty of that explanation is it scales across creatures all the way down to quite simple ones, all the way through to human beings, whose affective responses, for example, to different smartphones, will determine their behaviour. It's hard to overstate the implications of this rethinking of what's going on in our heads. It suggests that cognition is the encoding and processing of information according to its affective characteristics. So it's a different way of thinking about thinking. In terms of language and philosophy, it proposes that words don't really ever refer to things, but only to the reactions that those things or experiences cause in us, which is a radical rethink of many areas of kind of language and philosophy, and suggests, for example, the reasons why Wittgenstein went so horribly wrong. Ethics and decision-making, our decisions are based on how we feel about a situation, not on rules. As people like Kahneman have found, we will quite easily come up with rationalizations of our emotional processes, but like many areas of memory, we can be quite confused about what's really going on. With AI, artificial intelligence, it suggests that since no machine feels, and since all of our cognition is based on feeling, there's no way that AI will ever be able to process information in the ways that we, human beings or living organisms, generally do. Instead, they'll only ever be able to approximate that using a very different process. Comparative psychology, it suggests, as Darwin did frankly, that human cognition is different only in degree from other species, not in nature. We are quantitatively, not qualitatively different from other animals. And yet, learning theory and education is peppered with all manner of bizarre hypotheses that you couldn't possibly apply to animals. Episodic and semantic memory, for example. Do we think rats have separate episodic and semantic memory? Culture and identity. Again, culture and identity reflect shared or idiosyncratic affective significance. We're bound together in a culture because we care about the same sorts of things, which also define the groups that we belong to. And interestingly, those are the things that make us different. So finally, neurodiversity. Our cognitive diversity stems from the differences in affective significance we attach to experiences. To give a simple example, if you and I take a train ride and I care about architecture and you care about plants, we will remember very different things from that train ride. And those differences in what we care about, which in turn affect our reactions, which affects our memories, those are the things that make us different as individuals. What does this mean for learning and for education? Well, frankly, it means that there are only ever two conditions that we find ourselves in. One on the left, which is a push condition, where, frankly, somebody just doesn't care very much about something, or to put it technically, there is weak affective context associated with that. Let's say I don't care about architecture. How are you going to get me to memorize anything about it? Well, you can't do that by force-feeding me stuff, as Ebbinghaus tried to do. At least if you do, it will be grossly inefficient and I'll forget most of it. Instead, you have to transfer affective significance. You have to use a mechanism which really makes me react to things. And those sorts of mechanisms tend to be those which are rich with affective significance, things like simulation or storytelling. If you want to shift what people react to, then you need to make them care. And often you do that by building on their existing cares. The other condition is the pull condition. And this is one we're all familiar with. This is where we really care about something, like how do we plant petunias or how do we bake brownies? And what do? We Google it. And what do we get? Just simple instructions. That's all you need. People like Atul Gawande found that when people care about something, a checklist can be a fantastically useful resource. Nobody ever Googles eLearning modules. Why not? You'd think with all the instructional design they'd be loving them. But they don't, because when you care about something, you will pull information without affective context. Things like instructions or answers or checklists. So how do we build this into learning design? Well, first off, consider these questions. How would you do these things? How would you find your way in a strange city? How would you find a restaurant in a new area? How would you learn about a person you'll be meeting or choose a good movie to watch? I've asked these questions many times, and the sorts of answers that people tend to give me are YouTube or Google or IMDb or LinkedIn. What they never say is classroom or eLearning. And the problem is that the way we learn every day no longer resembles educational conventions. And if you look at research, people like Jane Hart's Survey of Learners in the Workplace or memory research, you find that classroom, though it's liked, because people frankly like to get together, that's just a fun thing to do. And they tell us that every time we ask about classroom, that networking was one of the best bits of it. It's ineffective. We know they forget somewhere between 65 and 90% within a couple of weeks, and it's expensive. And e-learning is deeply disliked, equally ineffective. US Department of Education meta-study found that classroom and e-learning were about equally ineffective, but it's cheap. So what do we do instead? Well, we can do two things. We can do experiences which simulate challenges typically, or resources which help people tackle the challenges they already have. And really it is that simple. You should be doing one of those two things. If you're in education, you should be taking people who have an interest and building challenges which deepen that concern and enable them to pull on the information that's available. What you should never be doing is just dumping information on people, especially if they don't care about it, which is generally the case if you haven't asked them or involved them in the design. So, educational experiences typically which turn programs into simulations of real challenges or real work, resources which are about things like checklists and guides, things which help people to get the stuff done that they already care about. And just a reminder, these correspond to these two affective context conditions. So experiences are about typically simulation or storytelling, about pushing affective significance, and the pull condition is resources where we know that somebody cares about something. So we give them the stuff they want. This has huge implications for L&D, learning and development capabilities, because it means that we really need to develop these two kinds of capabilities to develop these two kinds of things. Or it may be that you decide to become one kind of L&D professional focusing on experiences, or another focusing on performance support or resources. But something that's really important in all of this is, how do you know what people care about? The whole model rests on the assumption that memory is driven by what matters to us. We encode things according to what we react to, and what we react to will be different depending on what I care about versus what you care about. You may sit through a lecture on chemistry because you love chemistry. I can guarantee I'll forget almost every bit of it, but I regularly sit through learning theory lectures and actually remember quite a lot because I have strong reactions to it, whereas I suspect you would find it incredibly boring. So person-centered design is the secret to understanding which technique to apply. So this 5DI model which I use puts the learner at the heart of the process. Basically, in step 2, we really discover what are the concerns that underpin performance. It's not enough just to look at the tasks they're doing. Imagine you have a daughter and it's her first day at school. Certainly there are a number of tasks which she may have to do, but what's really driving her learning is her concerns. And what sort of concerns might those be? Well, she doesn't want to look stupid, she wants to make friends, she doesn't want to stand out, she wants to fit in. Those are the things that really matter, and those are the sorts of things which will affect what she encodes. So putting the person at the heart of the design process is essential. And of course we don't do that in education. We design a curriculum and then we sort of more or less assume that everybody absorbs it in the same way. How does that look like in practice? Well, one of the techniques that we use in person-centered design is something like a user journey, if you're familiar with that. We get people to draw what we call an emotion curve and to mark key milestones on it. So when you started in a job, or when you became a leader, or in the average course of a year or a month, what does that curve look like? And that's really important because telling stories is often the way that people naturally highlight their concerns and things they care about. So by drawing this curve, you can get a really good insight into what are the things that are really driving people's learning. So this is a typical curve you can see for a leader. Having interviewed hundreds of leaders, you find something like this occurs again and again. Once you understand what's driving their learning, you can sort them into boxes. You can say, well, here are all the resources that might help somebody. If they, for example, need to know what to do, a checklist might be great. But if, for example, you discover that they don't really care enough about something like performance conversations, or they need to develop deeper capability, then maybe that's a good opportunity to introduce an experience. Does this work? Yes, in fact, it works fantastically well. This was an induction project many years ago where we took 8 hours worth of e-learning modules that only 300 people had ever completed and replaced it with a resource based on what people said they really cared about when they joined. And we found a radical. We went from a few hundred completions to 1 million hits to this site. Was that just because it was more entertaining? No, because actually the most popular resource was a checklist. People crave that kind of structure. So the simple checklist was the thing that people most downloaded. So as I say, that was all elective usage, far in excess of the actual number of people joining. But we developed useful stuff, resources that answer the questions and things and help people with things that they cared about. What about experience design? This was an 8-week program where we took very senior leaders through something which resembled real life in terms of their digital transformation. They had to understand people's digital personas. They then met those people in real life and had to try and interact with them, engage with them, understand what really mattered to them. They had to hire new people. They had to present at a conference, and they had to handle difficult customer care responses. So building experiences which really brought to life why these things matter to people. And it was tremendously effective at actually then driving their learning beyond that. So in conclusion, the affective context model is the first general theory of learning. It is a radical reconceptualization of what we do in learning, what learning is, what cognition is, and how we should do education. I've tried to summarize some of the highlights in this short talk, but of course I've skipped over some of the detail and some of the arguments. So by all means, if you wish, please buy the book. And thank you for listening.